Hello, 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 and welcome to Ladypreneur Academy. We are going to be talking about pricing on today, and I am more than excited to share this information with you guys just because it's something that's important to business owners. Many of you may be in a place where you're stuck trying to figure out how much you should charge customers for your product or service, or you may be wondering whether you're charging too much or too little. So this is going to be a very good training, actually one of the most important trainings that you'll see out in the business world today, just because we want to make sure that you are putting yourself in a position where you can be profitable. Now, we know the underlying tone of Ladypreneur Academy as a whole is we want to make sure that you're profitable, not just making money, because a lot of times we can spend more money than we make and not even realize it. So we want to make sure that you guys are profitable as you are going through and building your businesses. So in order to be profitable, you have to make sure that you are pricing your products and services correctly. So let's go ahead and get started. I don't want to belabor the hour anymore. Let me get myself off the screen so I won't be a distraction to you. So again, this is Profit Pricing Pro. Again, I am Juanika Cuthbertson and just sharing a little bit of information with you on today. The main points that we'll cover is why we need to talk about it. We talked a little bit about this right then, but I definitely want to go into a little bit more detail what should be considered when it comes to pricing and how to really figure out how to be profitable if you're being profitable for both services, physical products, and digital products. So definitely pay attention. If you don't have your notebook, your iPad, a pen and paper, whatever it is that you use to take notes, you want to go ahead and grab that now, because this is going to be something that has the potential to really change your business. So one of the quotes that I love the most when it comes to profit is that price reflects value. So you always want to keep in mind that the prices you set will really tell the story of how much you're worth to people. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't want to have quality over quantity. What it means is that you want to make sure that you're pricing yourself at a point where people take you seriously. If you listen to this quote by John Kramer, it says, "Don't sell yourself short. No one will value you. Set a fair price for you, your book, your services, whatever it is that you have to offer." Most of us set way too low a price. Put it a little higher than you would normally be inclined to do. The worst that can happen is someone will come along and steal it. What does that mean? Just like I said, a lot of times we put ourselves in a position where we're pricing ourselves too low. You don't want to price yourself on necessarily the time that you spend making a product. You don't want to price yourself necessarily on different events that happen around the product, the cost of the materials, different things like that. But it varies depending on which industry you're in. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but you want to make sure that you price yourself according to your value. And if you paid attention to our market research, you definitely want to see how people value your products and services in your industry. So when we were going through and we were talking about what your customers are looking for and what your target audience and your avatars really value in that space, you want to make sure that you're in alignment with what people really see themselves paying, how they value the industry, and you want to make sure that you're in alignment and on target with that. So let's keep going. Let's talk about the basics. Now, these are some things that you always want to remember, because when you think about pricing and you think about profit can only be available to you if you consider your cost. So like I said earlier, a lot of times we put ourselves in a position where we're setting prices, not really recognizing how much it's costing us to make stuff, not necessarily recognizing how much it's costing us to deliver different things, or not recognizing how much it's costing us to teach certain things or prepare for certain things. So you always want to remember the cost when it comes to your profit. If you're setting your prices based on revenue alone, you could be doing yourself a huge disservice. So profit will always equal your revenue minus your cost. So let's talk about some of the different costs that you'll encounter as a business owner. Now, I put overhead costs first, and we'll get into fixed costs versus variable costs. But the reason why I broke it out is because overhead costs can be both fixed and variable. These are the things that do not contribute to your revenue. If you think about fixed overhead costs, these are costs associated with operating your business that you need to be able to run your business, but they're not necessarily contributing to your bottom line. So if you think about some of your fixed overhead costs, it may be rent, it may be insurance, it may be legal fees, it may be the telephone bills, your utilities, different things like that. If you think about some of the variable costs, it may be your advertising, your the amount of interest that you pay, the repairs that you have to take into consideration, some of your supplies, your taxes. So if travel expenditures, if you think about different things like that, it really breaks down into what's not contributing to your overall income. Now, I know I talked a lot about fixed costs versus variable costs. So if you're a little confused on that, let's go ahead and jump into it. So a fixed cost is a cost that doesn't change based on an increase or a decrease in your product. So what that means is that it doesn't matter how much you're making, how much you're selling, you're going to have to pay these costs regardless. You're going to have to pay the rent on a brick and mortar building, rent or mortgage, whatever, on a brick and mortar building, regardless if that's what you use to run your business. If you have an online-based business, regardless of whether you sign on to the internet or not, you're going to have to pay your internet fees. So I want you to just be mindful of the costs that you have that are going to be there regardless. And then you want to think about your variable costs. So your variable costs are costs that are dependent on what you're making. So they do change based on the amount of units you produce. So variable costs could include things like, I just mentioned it in the overhead, but it could include things like the amount of repairs, the amount of supplies, the amount of materials, the amount of advertising you do. It's really just based on what you're willing to produce and what you're willing to sell, what you're willing to put up money for. Those are variable costs. And then you want to think about your labor and material costs. Now, these can go for both products and services. These are costs determined by the amount of materials or labor required to produce, but they are operational costs. And what do operational costs mean? It means that they contribute to your bottom line. So these are good costs. If you are going to make an apple pie, apples would be considered materials. Flour would be considered material. Cinnamon would be considered material. So it really contributes to your bottom line because you need these materials to be able to make it. Now, if you consider labor in that same example, the amount of time that it takes you to prepare your ingredients would be considered a labor cost. The amount of time you spend mixing would be considered a labor cost. The amount of time that it takes for it to go into the oven before it's ready would be considered a labor cost. So you really want to figure out how much money it's going to take you to be able to provide the materials that you need and the amount of labor time that you need to be able to produce your product or service successfully. And guys, I know I'm going over a lot of technical stuff here. So if you have any questions, definitely feel free to raise your hand in the chat and let me know. But this is something that I definitely want to make sure that I am covering in detail. So if you get lost, let me know. Okay, so now let's talk about some things that need to be considered when it comes to equations that you need to think about for being able to price your products at a point where you're being profitable. Okay. The first thing we just talked about it, your total costs. You always want to know exactly what your costs will be. Now, your total cost is everything. It's your fixed costs, it's your variable costs, which includes your labor and material. It includes your operational expenses. It includes your overhead costs. So this is everything wrapped up in one. That's going to be your total cost. Now, again, your profit is going to be the amount of money that you bring in as a whole, subtracted by the amount of money that you're putting out as a whole. I hope this is making sense. So when you're thinking about your profit, again, don't just think about how much money is coming in. You also have to think about how much money you're going to have to dish out in order for your product or service to be successful. Now, when you're figuring out your labor rate or your labor costs, you want to think of it in terms of units. So First and foremost, if you are working an hourly position, or if you are working by time, or if you are working in any kind of way, you got to figure out exactly what your rate will be. So my time is worth such and such and such per hour, or my time is worth such and such per pie, or my time is worth such and such per presentation, or my time is worth such and such per training. So you have to figure out what unit means to you. It's going to be your product, your service, your digital business, your presentation, whatever it is going to be that. So you got to figure out the amount of time you worked plus the value of that time. Multiplied by the value of that time, divided by the number of units. So if I'm a professional speaker and I'm preparing for a speech, it means that I have to both put a presentation together and I have to practice, right? So my unit is a speech, or my unit is a presentation. So let's say I know that I'm worth, let's say, for example, if I was just starting out and I wanted to charge $500 per presentation, right? So I would therefore know that my labor rate per unit equals 500. So 500 would be the total of the amount of time I worked plus how much is worth for me to produce one presentation. I'm sorry, I keep saying plus. Times how much is worth for me to produce that presentation divided by 1, because it's one presentation at $500. Does that make sense to you guys? And I know I got confusing with the plus and the multiplication. So just so we're clear, it's the time worked times the rate that you're worth, or the value of the thing, the value of your time, divided by the number of units. Hope that makes sense. All right, so let's move on to price. When you think about pricing your products, it should always be greater than the total cost of your product per unit, right? So if my presentation is, if I know it's going to be a total cost of $500, which is my labor rate, which is my materials, which is the rent and all that stuff, if I know that it's going to be $500 per unit, that means that at $500 of a total cost divided by one presentation, that means however much I charge for a speaking engagement needs to be over $500. Otherwise, I'm not making a profit. I could go out and charge $350 and say, you know what? I think this is a good price. I want to do folks a favor. I want to do this. I want to do that. I could go out of business as a speaker doing favors if I'm not pricing myself effectively. If it's costing me $500 to produce a presentation and I sell it for $350, I'm doing myself a disservice. So definitely keep that in mind as you're going through and you're thinking about the prices for your products and services. So let's talk about services first. There are a couple of considerations that you really need to think about when it comes down to just services in general. Okay, you need to think about your labor rate. How much time does it take you to service a client? So let's say that you are let's say you're a hairstylist, right? How much time does it take you to perform a service on a customer or a client? How much time does it take you to wash the hair? How much time does it take you to condition the hair? How much time does it take you to blow dry the hair and style the hair? All of that needs to go into consideration. Then you need to think about your overhead costs, both fixed and variable, to be honest. So how much is your booth rent if you don't own your shop? If you do own your shop, how much is your mortgage? How much are you going to have to put into the location where you do hair? How much is your water bill for washing hair? How much is your utility bill when it comes down to making sure that you have electricity, you have lights on, you're able to plug up your blow dryer, all those things, right? You need to think about your overhead costs. Then you need to think about your operating costs, which could also be the materials involved. So how much is it going to cost you to make sure that you have shampoo? How much is it going to cost you to make sure that you have the products, the edge control, whatever, that's needed for you to be able to complete your service with quality. So as you're going through and you're figuring out your costs, then you need to think about, okay, as a hairstylist, for example, all of these, I'm not going to charge one customer for my mortgage, or I'm not going to charge one customer for my booth rent, or I'm not going to charge one customer for a bottle of shampoo or curly serum or whatever, right? You're not going to charge one client and make them carry the weight for the cost of your materials, the cost of your operations, the cost of your overhead, because it can be split. You can share it. You're not going to use all of your product on one customer. So then you have to figure out, okay, once I get all my costs together, how many clients is it going to take me for me to come out ahead, right? Because your total cost will always be your fixed costs plus your variable costs. So when it comes down to figuring out your price, you have to think about how many clients you're going to be dividing your total cost by. And then you want to set your price above that equation. I hope that makes sense. If you guys have questions, ask them. Now let's jump into products. Think about your overhead costs or your fixed costs for products, right? What is it going to take as a part of your operating costs? Again, where are you creating the product? What type of fixed costs are involved in the creation and making sure that you have the space available to create the product? Or also think about your variable costs. What goes in to making sure that you're able to produce your product? What about the labor rate? How much time does it take you to produce each unit? What materials are involved to producing each unit? Is there a shipping expense? Now, a lot of times this is something that we as entrepreneurs don't necessarily pay attention to, but we have to ask ourselves the question, is there going to be a cost to shipping? Whether it's shipping materials to you, whether you're covering the cost of shipping the finished product to your customers, this is something that you always need to take into considerations, because the blind spots, guys, are the things that will tear your business slam up. And that's not what we want. So definitely consider the shipping expense, whether it be, again, on your end or on your customer's end. And then again, you want to make sure that your price is greater than your total cost divided by the units or what you're producing, how many you're producing. Does that make sense? Because your total cost is going to be all of your costs together, everything we just talked about. So make sure that as you're pricing your products, you have to divide your total cost by the number of products you'll produce. And let's talk about digital and content. Now, here's where it can get gray, to be honest, because the one thing that I love about content and the one thing that I love about digital is that you don't necessarily have to continue to reproduce over and over and over again to be able to sell a digital product or what's considered a content product, right? So considerations for digital usually are the same. You want to think about your overhead costs, your fixed costs, your operating expenses, your variable costs, how much time is going to take you to get that presentation together, how much time is going to take you to get that e-course together. But also something that you want to take into consideration are your expenses for the technology, right? Are there web costs that you're going to have to incur to make sure that you can produce this product or service? Are there software costs involved? A lot of times we use different platforms to be able to host our courses, or we use different platforms to be able to share a presentation, or we use different platforms to be able to serve as a speakers bureau to go and find different speaking opportunities for us. So you have to think about what are the additional costs that may be involved. You know, if you have a website where people are coming to get more information on you, is there a cost for your landing page? Is there a cost for your hosting? Is there a cost for advertising? All those things. You want to make sure that whatever costs are involved, that you're listing them. And then you think about the number of sales. Now, here's why I love the digital space and the content space. Because if I'm a professional speaker, which I do professional speaking, one thing I love, for example, I did a presentation or I did a tour with a digital organization, and we were going around and we were talking about marketing on a bunch of different occasions. The thing that I love the most is that out of all the stops, I only had to really do the work once. What does that mean? I only built the presentation one time. And I used that presentation over and over and over and over and over again, because the goal wasn't to give different content to different people. The goal was to give the same content to different people. So I had to think about, okay, as I'm pricing this presentation, I'm going to do the work once, but I'm going to deliver this over and over and over again. Now that could be to your advantage or it could be a disadvantage. The advantage of it is that you're able to lower your prices. That may be a disadvantage. You're able to lower your prices if you need to, right? But another advantage is you can charge for the cost of the presentation, and you can get paid the cost of that presentation over and over and over again, even though you only have to do it once. So let's focus on that advantage. That's the beauty of this industry when it comes to content, whether it be digital, whether it be a book, whether it be audio, a podcast, whatever. You do the work once. People listen to the same thing over and over again. People see the same video over and over again. People download the same infographic over and over again, but you only did the work once. So that's what I love about the digital and content space, just because it's unbeatable, but you still want to make sure that you are taking different things into consideration as you are building out your prices, because you want to make sure that your costs don't exceed your pricing. Otherwise, you will lose your profit. So we talked about a lot in this presentation, and I know it can be overwhelming. I tried to go a little slower this time. I hope I didn't trip you guys up with the pluses versus multiplication and all that stuff. But I definitely want to make sure that I allow time for questions, because I know that this is some heavy content. What I want you to do is challenge yourself. Take some time this week and go and map out all of your costs. I want you to put it in whatever's comfortable for you. I like to use Excel just because some of the equations can be done a lot faster. But if you're not comfortable with Excel, you can list them out on a notebook, add them up, do the equations manually, whatever it may be. I just want you to list out your expenses and make sure that as a business owner, you're aware of what's coming in and going out of your organization, because if not, you can get got really quickly. And that's not what we want for you. So do yourself a favor, map out your pricing, map out your expenses, map out your overhead, map out your operating costs, map out your fixed costs versus your variable costs, map out all these things. And as you're going to create a price per unit, make sure that your expenses are covered so that you're not constantly digging yourself deeper in a hole. I hope that makes sense to you guys. So we'll take a couple seconds to get some questions answered. But definitely do the challenge. Make sure that you are listing out your costs versus your revenue so that you can understand what your pricing should be to give you a profit. Sound good? Awesome.